They say the world forgets its quietest endings, but not this one. 40,000 years ago, in the age of ice and silence, one being stood where the earth met the sea. He was the last of his kind, a creature both human and ancient, carrying within him the final memory of a vanished world. Beneath skies of ash and snow, he hunted, dreamed, and waited as the warmth of his people faded from the land. What he left behind was not extinction, but legacy, the first spark of us. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the past can whisper through firelight, and subscribe so these forgotten stories keep finding you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far this ancient fire still travels. Now, close your eyes, breathe with the rhythm of the wind, and return with me to the secret life of the last Neanderthal. 40,000 years ago, Europe was not the world we know. It was a vast and frozen wilderness where glaciers stretched like sleeping giants, swallowing mountains and valleys beneath walls of blue ice. The sun was pale and distant, its light scattering weakly through a sky veiled in cold mist. The air itself seemed heavy with silence. There were no cities, no plowed fields, no human voices. Only the wind, carving its song through endless snow, and the faint crackle of frost beneath ancient feet. In this landscape, life clung to the edges of survival. Herds of mammoth and bison drifted like shadows across the tundra, their paths etched into permafrost. Woolly rhinoceroses scraped the frozen earth for brittle grass. Saber-toothed cats stalked from the tree line, their breath clouds in the air, waiting for the slow and the weak. Yet even here, where every heartbeat demanded endurance, another kind of human endured. The Neanderthal was built for this world. Broad-chested, thick-limbed, wrapped in furs stitched by flint-tipped needles, they moved with quiet certainty through a land that would have crushed us. Their faces carried the weight of adaptation, heavy brows to shield the eyes from glare, strong hands to shape the tools that carved their survival from bone and stone. Each breath they drew was a victory against the cold. Each fire they lit a defiance against extinction. They did not rush. They did not wander aimlessly. They knew the rhythm of the earth, the timing of herds, the scent of thaw beneath the snow. They followed the cycles of life as faithfully as the moon followed the dark. Every gesture, every decision, was born from generations of memory knowledge, carried not in books or words, but in instinct and repetition. At night, when the wind died and the sky opened, they would lift their eyes to the stars brighter then than now and see the same constellations we do. But to them, the heavens were not a place of myth or science. They were a clock, a guide, a map written in light. The Neanderthal did not wonder who made the stars. They learned when to move by them, when to hunt, when to rest. Their wisdom was not imagination but survival. This was the world before ours began, a world ruled not by invention, but by endurance. A world where fire meant life, and a single hunt could decide a tribe's fate. And within that fragile balance, beneath the shadow of glaciers and auroras, humanity was not yet one species. Two walked the earth then, separated not by intelligence, but by time. One would vanish into history, the other would inherit it. But for now, the world still belonged to them, the masters of ice, the children of the cold, the first to call this frozen land home. In the age of ice, survival was not a choice. It was a daily negotiation with a world that offered little mercy. The Neanderthals, the people of the cold, knew this better than any creature that walked beside them. Every sunrise brought a test, every storm a question. Could they endure one more day in a land made of frost and stone? Their answer was written not in words, but in the quiet strength of their lives. Their homes were born from the bones of giants. Mammoth ribs arched over the frozen ground, draped with hides stiffened by wind and smoke. Inside, firelight flickered across walls of ivory and sinew, painting ancient patterns that danced with the breath of the flames. These shelters were not grand, but they were miracles of understanding a harmony between necessity and ingenuity. Where the earth froze solid, they carved warmth from what it gave. The Neanderthals shaped their world with hands that knew both patience and precision. From the heart of stone, they coaxed blades sharp enough to cut through hide and meat, delicate enough to carve antler and bone. Flint flakes littered their hearths like the petals of a forgotten craft, each piece a fragment of their silent art. There were no metals here, no wheels, no written marks of progress. Yet every tool was a thought made visible, an idea made solid, a whisper of intelligence refined by generations. Their speech was low and rhythmic, more felt than heard. They spoke through gesture, through glance, through the music of shared understanding. Around their fires, their words melted into the crackle of burning wood and the sigh of the wind. To live here, one did not need eloquence, one needed awareness. The cold shaped not just their homes and habits, but their very bodies. Their bones grew thick to bear the burden of constant struggle. Their chests expanded to drink in the heavy air of winter. Their skin weathered beneath endless wind, and their eyes narrowed to see through snow and glare. Every feature was an adaptation, every scar a signature of survival. And still, there was beauty in their endurance. The people of the cold did not fight the land. They listened to it. They moved when the herds moved, waited when the earth slept, hunted only what they needed. Their world was harsh, but it was also whole. In the frozen silence of prehistoric Europe, they were the masters of balance, creatures neither defeated by the elements nor detached from them. Every breath they took was an act of defiance, a quiet declaration that life, even in the bleakest places, could still find a way to burn. In the endless night of the Ice Age, fire was more than a discovery, it was a covenant between humanity and the earth itself. For the Neanderthals, fire was not a luxury or a symbol. It was survival, distilled into light. The moment the first spark caught on dry grass, it was as if the frozen world breathed for the first time. In that flicker of orange and gold, the cold retreated. Shadows took shape, and life reclaimed its fragile claim upon the land. Within the caves of Europe, soot still stains the ceilings, silent proof that these people mastered an element that shaped the course of existence. Fire was warmth against the blizzards, a barrier against the prowling eyes of beasts, a place where hunger was soothed and stories, though wordless, began to form. Around its light, they cooked their food, softened their tools, cured their hides. But beneath these acts of necessity lay something deeper. Fire became the first gathering place, the first shared memory. The Neanderthals did not invent fire. They learned to keep it alive. In a world where every storm could erase a family's existence, the ability to preserve flame was sacred. They carried embers in carved stones or bark-wrapped bundles, shielding them from the wind. When the last glow began to fade, they would coax it back to life with breath and patience, hands trembling not from fear, but from reverence. Theirs was a relationship built on trust between human and flame, between endurance and hope. The firelight revealed more than warmth. It exposed color. In its glow, minerals became paint, walls became canvases, and the first traces of symbolic thought began to take shape. Red ochre, black soot, the soft lines of fingers pressed into stone, all born in that shared light. Whether these marks were ritual or reflection, no one can say, but each stroke tells us something essential. They saw beauty even in survival. Beyond its glow, the night belonged to predators and ice, but within the circle of light, something profound stirred. The fire changed how they saw each other. Faces became visible. Eyes reflected the same flame. The crackle and hum of burning wood created rhythm, perhaps even the first heartbeat of music. It was here, in this warmth, that community became real, not through language, but through presence. The firemakers of prehistory were not conquerors of the element, they were its keepers. Each flame was a reminder that even in a world of endless winter, light could endure. And in that endurance, something extraordinary began: the awakening of the human spirit, glowing softly against the darkness of time. Long before words, before story or song, knowledge was carried in the hands. Every motion, every strike of stone against stone, was a memory ancient, unspoken, and exact. The Neanderthals were not merely survivors. They were craftsmen of necessity, sculptors of endurance. Their tools were not crude fragments of a primitive mind. They were the instruments of a deep intelligence, refined through thousands of years of quiet repetition. Across Ice Age valleys, shards of flint still lie buried in the soil, shining faintly when caught by the light. Each one holds the rhythm of a life once lived. These people knew stone as we might know words. They understood its veins, its fractures, its potential. To shape a blade was not a random act. It was the result of understanding geometry without ever naming it. They knew how to angle each strike so that the flint would flake in predictable ways, producing edges sharp enough to cut, hide, or carve bone. In caves and open plains alike, they carried with them small toolkits, cores, flakes, hammerstones, and scrapers, objects as essential as breath. Archaeologists who uncover them today find precision where once there was only assumption. The Neanderthal did not fumble through invention, they perfected it. Some of their tools show retouching, the careful reworking of old blades to extend their life. Others bear traces of hafting, where wooden handles were bound with sinew and resin to create composite weapons. These were not accidents of instinct. They were signs of planning, of foresight, of thought. The act of shaping stone was also an act of patience. Every spark that flew from flint was a small miracle of skill. Through repetition, the knowledge deepened. A father taught a son by showing, not by speaking. A mother sharpened edges for cutting meat and hide, her fingers tracing the same curves her ancestors had traced for millennia. In this silent continuity, the story of their people was preserved. Stone was their archive. Long after voices faded and bones turned to dust, the flint remained. Each blade is a sentence, each tool a paragraph, in the unwritten chronicle of their existence. In its chipped surface lies a code that we are only beginning to read. When we look at these tools today, we do not just see fragments of survival, we see intention, creativity, and memory made physical. The Neanderthals may have lived without language as we know it, but their hands spoke fluently through stone. And through that enduring language, they told the world that they understood it. In a world ruled by hunger and frost, tenderness was a quiet act of rebellion. The Neanderthal mother lived in a landscape that offered her nothing easily, no safety, no promise, no guarantee that tomorrow would come. Yet, within her arms, against the cold breath of the Ice Age wind, life continued. A child's heartbeat, faint and steady, was a sound of defiance against extinction itself. To understand these people, we must see them not through the lens of survival alone, but through the small moments that held their humanity together. Archaeologists have found the traces of their care: tiny teeth that show signs of nourishment, bones healed from injury, skeletons of elders tended long past their usefulness to the hunt. These clues whisper that affection existed long before civilization, long before language could shape the word love. It lived in touch, in protection, in the instinct to keep another warm. Inside their shelters, smoke hung in the air, curling toward the ceiling of hide and bone. The light of the fire revealed the outlines of mothers and children pressed close together. Here, the world narrowed to the rhythm of breath and the steady crackle of flame. The mother's hands, rough from labor, were still gentle. She knew how to wrap fur around fragile skin, how to calm the child with low murmurs that blended with the wind. Her voice carried a melody not meant to be remembered, but to reassure, to remind the living that they were still alive. Outside, the wolves moved through the snow, their eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Danger was constant, but fear was not new. The Neanderthal mother had inherited strength from generations before her. She carried within her not just a child, but the memory of a species, the learned rhythm of endurance, the will to begin again, even as the world froze around her. Fossils tell us that Neanderthal children grew quickly, their bones thickening early, their lives often brief. Many never reached adulthood, and yet, the traces of their existence linger in the care they received. Broken bones mended, signs of sheltering and feeding during sickness, acts that reveal not beasts, but beings capable of empathy. In that frozen age, love was not a luxury, it was a survival strategy. The mother and her child were not symbols of innocence. They were the core of resilience itself. Each heartbeat, each whispered hum in the darkness, was a bridge across generations. And though neither would ever know how near the end had come, in that moment held close to the warmth of another they embodied the most enduring truth of all, that even in a world of ice, life will always reach for life. The hunt began long before the first step was taken. It began in the quiet hours before dawn, when frost clung to the grass and the breath of the earth rose in thin, ghostly veils. For the Neanderthals, the hunt was not just a means of survival, it was the pulse of their existence, the rhythm that tied them to the seasons, to the land, and to one another. They lived in a world where every meal was earned through patience, endurance, and an understanding of nature that bordered on reverence. The mammoth and the bison were not simply prey. They were titans of the Ice Age, creatures that could kill as easily as they could sustain. To bring one down required precision and courage, but above all, unity. The success of the hunt meant warmth, nourishment, and survival through another winter. Failure meant hunger, and hunger in this age could mean extinction. Across open plains glazed with ice, the Neanderthals moved silently, their footprints pressed deep into the frozen earth. Archaeological sites across Europe preserve this story in the soil, flint points, found alongside massive bones, the marks of coordinated pursuit. These people were not reckless hunters. They studied the wind, watched the trails, read the language of the ground. Their minds were as sharp as their spears. Their weapons were crafted from flint and ash wood, the points hardened by fire. The shafts balanced for flight and strength. These were the tools of experts, the product of countless generations who had learned the exact moment to strike. They did not waste energy, nor did they kill without purpose. Each act of the hunt was measured and deliberate, an exchange between hunter and hunted that both seemed to understand. When they approached their quarry, everything else fell away. The world became heartbeat and breath. The mammoth, sensing danger, trumpeted through the cold air, its cry echoing across the valley. In that instant, time contracted. The throw of a spear, the rush of movement, the sound of hooves thundering over snow, all collapsed into a single flash of survival. Afterward came the silence. The kill was not triumph, but gratitude. The Neanderthals used every part of what they took: the meat for food, the hide for clothing and shelter, the bone for tools and fuel. Nothing was wasted. In this balance of taking and giving, they mirrored the earth itself. The great hunt was more than a chase. It was a communion between species, between strength and need. It demanded instinct, cooperation, and respect for the power of life. And as the smoke of the fires rose later that night, curling into the pale northern sky, it told the oldest story in human history, the story of beings who learned that to live in harmony with the world, one must first learn to understand it. When the hunt was over, the fire became the center of the world. In its glow, the harshness of the Ice Age softened for a few precious hours. The Neanderthals, weary from pursuit and danger, gathered close around the warmth, their faces flickering in the amber light. This was not just a meal, it was a celebration, a ritual, a reminder that even in a frozen wilderness, there was still joy to be found in being alive. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and smoke. The mammoth's fat hissed as it dripped into the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Archaeologists uncovering ancient hearths have found traces of these moments. Charred bones cracked open for marrow, stones blackened by centuries of use, ashes layered one upon another like the pages of a forgotten chronicle. Every layer tells the same story, that even in the most brutal of climates, these people built their lives around the hearth, where survival turned into culture. The feast was more than sustenance. It was communion. Around the fire, they shared not only food but something intangible, a sense of belonging. Laughter, low and rough, mingled with the crackle of burning wood. Hands passed portions of meat from one to another, an unspoken understanding that no one ate alone. In this small act of sharing, the essence of humanity revealed itself. Their minds, though shaped by survival, carried imagination. The glow of the flames cast moving shadows along the cave walls, and in those shifting shapes, they may have seen stories the herds they chased, the spirits of the animals they depended upon, the rhythm of life repeating in endless cycles. Anthropologists studying soot patterns and pigments suggest that the Neanderthals might have painted their walls near the same fires that fed them, blending survival with expression, sustenance with art. For this one night, the dangers of the world stayed outside the circle of light. The wind howled across the plains, but within the fire's warmth, the tribe was safe. Their voices rose in murmured tones, rhythmic and deep, perhaps mimicking the pulse of the earth itself. The stars above, ancient and bright, mirrored the glow below. The fire was not only warmth, it was identity, connection, memory. When the embers finally dimmed, only the faint scent of smoke and ash remained. But the memory of the feast endured, carried forward by those who lived to see another dawn. It was a moment carved out of time, a pause between struggle and sleep, where laughter met survival and life felt, for a heartbeat, infinite. In that fragile warmth, beneath the endless winter sky, the Neanderthals found their meaning not through conquest, but through togetherness. Winter was not a season in the Ice Age, it was an empire. It ruled the land with quiet cruelty, swallowing valleys, rivers, and hope beneath layers of unbroken snow. The Neanderthals, who had once thrived in this frozen world, now faced its darkest months. The herds that sustained them drifted south beyond reach. The skies turned gray for weeks without light, and the cold pressed harder than bone. This was the winter of hunger, when even endurance began to tremble. The signs of their struggle remain etched in the archaeological record. Charred roots, roasted bones, fragments of wild plants found deep within ancient hearths, traces of desperate meals shared in silence. The rivers that once gave water and fish had turned to stone beneath ice. The forests stood still, their branches heavy and brittle, as if mourning the life that once moved among them. For the Neanderthal, each passing day became a negotiation with hunger, each night a test of faith in the coming spring. The fire still burned, but it grew smaller now, fed by whatever scraps of wood could be gathered. Smoke drifted low and thin across the plains, rising from shelters built more for endurance than comfort. Inside those dim enclosures, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and damp fur, the remnants of survival clinging to every breath. Their tools dulled from overuse, their clothing patched and stiff with age. The world outside had gone silent, as though even the wind had grown too tired to speak. In this cold, time lost meaning. The sun, when it appeared, hovered weakly on the horizon, casting light but no warmth. Each heartbeat became slower, conserving strength. Children's laughter faded into quiet stillness. The old and the weak slipped away. Their bodies returned to the earth, frozen long before decay could claim them. Yet still, the Neanderthals endured. Driven by instinct, deeper than thought, a determination older than language, older than fear. Archaeologists who have studied their remains note the signs of this endurance: bones bearing marks of exhaustion, signs of malnutrition, yet also of care. The living tended to the dying. They shared the last scraps of food, even when there was not enough for themselves. That simple act, sharing in scarcity, was the purest expression of what it meant to be human. In the winter of hunger, every sound mattered. The distant crack of ice might mean water. The faint call of a raven might signal the presence of death or of food. The Neanderthals listened to the land as one might listen to a heartbeat, waiting for the faint rhythm of life to return. And so they waited, patient and unyielding, beneath the endless gray sky. They waited for warmth, for green to pierce the white, for the sound of moving water. They waited for spring that may never come. Yet, in that waiting, they proved something eternal. That even when nature turns against us, the will to live burns quietly on, like a dying ember refusing to go dark. It began with footprints, shallow impressions pressed into the snow, smaller than any they had seen before. They wound through the frost like a message written across the land. To the Neanderthals, these marks were not made by beasts, nor by the familiar feet of their own kind. The shape was delicate, the stride longer, lighter, as if the weight upon the earth had lessened. Something new had entered their world. Something human, but not them. Across the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe, two lineages now shared the same horizon. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had ruled this continent alone, mastering its cold heart. They knew every ridge, every cave, every migration of bison and mammoth. Their story had unfolded in isolation, a slow perfection of adaptation. But from the south, another story had begun to rise. Out of Africa came a different kind of wanderer, taller, more slender, with eyes that scanned the distance and minds that carried the seed of imagination. Archaeologists trace this quiet collision through fragments of bone and stone scattered across Europe's valleys. At sites like Bacho Kiro in Bulgaria and the Rhône Valley in France, artifacts tell of two human species occupying the same lands within overlapping generations. Their tools, though similar in shape, revealed subtle differences in design and thought. The newcomers, modern humans, crafted blades so fine they seemed to split light itself. They decorated them with pigments and ornaments. The Neanderthals, though equally skilled, favored sturdiness, precision, born from utility rather than beauty. Two worlds of intelligence had met, not superior and inferior, but different in rhythm and intent. To the Neanderthals, this meeting would not have been dramatic or sudden. It would have been a slow awakening, the kind that begins as curiosity before becoming fate. They may have seen the smoke of foreign fires drifting across the plains, or the remains of hunts too neatly organized to be the work of beasts. Perhaps they followed the tracks in silence, measuring them against their own. For the first time in their long history, they looked upon footprints that mirrored humanity, yet carried the shape of change. What did they think of these strangers? We can never truly know. But the archaeological record offers whispers. At Grotte Mandrine in southern France, alternating layers of occupation show Neanderthal and modern human groups using the same shelter within a few seasons of each other. The evidence suggests they did not always compete. There may have been peace, even curiosity. The edges of flint exchanged, food traded, glances shared across the flicker of firelight. Yet beneath that fragile coexistence lay something deeper: inevitability. The newcomers moved faster, bred quicker, spread farther. Their numbers grew as the Neanderthals waned. Climate change tightened its grip on the land, shrinking the territories that had once belonged to a single people. To survive meant to adapt, and the Neanderthals were already stretched to their limits. Still, there is beauty in imagining that first meeting, not as a moment of conquest, but of reflection. Two species looked at each other and saw something hauntingly familiar: For the first time, the Neanderthal was not alone. The stranger's tracks in the snow were not only the sign of another's arrival, they were a reflection of the inevitable flow of time, of change written into the bones of the earth. As snow fell over the plains, and the footprints slowly disappeared beneath white silence, the world itself seemed to shift. The age of one humanity was drawing to a close, even as another prepared to begin. The Neanderthals could not have known it then, but those small, light tracks were the first whispers of their own twilight. And though the wind would soon erase them, their imprint would remain in the memory of the land, in the firelight of those who followed, and in the ancient heartbeat of a species watching its reflection walk away. The first time it happened, it was not war, nor even words. It was light. Across the valley floor, beneath a sky heavy with snow, a faint orange glow trembled in the dark. For the Neanderthals who saw it, the sight must have been both familiar and foreign, a fire, unmistakably human, yet not their own. The flame flickered too steadily to be lightning, too warm to be the glow of molten stone. It was a reflection of themselves, born from hands that were not theirs. Two fires, two humanities, burning beneath the same ancient stars. That moment, though lost to time, marked one of the most profound crossroads in human history. The Neanderthals had roamed these lands for hundreds of millennia, shaping them with patience and resilience. But now, from distant continents, a new kind of human had arrived. Homo sapiens, travelers who had followed the rivers, the herds, and the pull of the unknown. For the first time, two intelligent species shared the same horizon. Archaeological traces suggest their encounters were not always violent. At sites like Châtel-Perron in France and Bacho-Kiro in Bulgaria, layers of habitation reveal periods of coexistence that may have lasted generations. The evidence hints at something remarkable, a blending of ideas. The newcomers brought ornaments, beads, bone tools, and pigment symbols of imagination that spoke a language older than speech. The Neanderthals, already masters of survival, began to refine their own crafts. Flint blades grew finer, shelters became more elaborate, pigments more abundant. It was as if two fires had touched, and each glowed brighter in response. To imagine that meeting is to glimpse the beginning of cultural exchange, the spark of something profoundly human. Across the silent distance of the valley, each fire must have told a story, the smoke of one rising into the same wind as the other. In that reflection of flame, the Neanderthals might have seen themselves, creatures of thought, warmth, and will. The strangers were not predators. They were mirrors. Still, beneath this fragile symmetry, tension brewed. The newcomers were many. Adaptable, curious. They traveled farther, organized more swiftly, multiplied more easily. Their technology evolved with breathtaking speed. The Neanderthals, though brilliant in their mastery of the cold, were creatures of constancy, not expansion. Their lives moved with the rhythm of the land, while the strangers seemed to move with the rhythm of imagination. Perhaps for years, maybe for centuries, both peoples shared the same valleys, the same rivers, the same caves. The boundary between them was not a line of battle but of understanding, one that blurred in firelight and faded in time. Interactions may have been cautious, trading glances, sharing scavenged kills, or simply watching one another from afar. The night sky above them was the same, but their futures were already diverging. When fire met fire, the world changed, not in a single night, but through the slow merging of stories, of gestures, of ways of living. The Neanderthals, for all their strength, faced a kind of transformation they had never known before. Not of body, but of meaning. Their world, once bound by ice and instinct, had begun to stretch towards something new, something uncertain. As dawn broke over that valley, smoke from two extinguished fires drifted together into the pale sky. In that mingling haze lay the beginning of humanity's long, shared inheritance, the moment when two kinds of human warmth met in the frozen dark. And for the first time, the earth held not one flame of life, but two, flickering side by side before time carried one away. There are moments in history that leave no ruins, no monuments, only a quiet trace in the human story. The first exchange between Neanderthal and modern human was one of them. It did not echo through time as battle or conquest. It was simpler, smaller, and infinitely more profound. Somewhere on a cold plain or within the shelter of a cave mouth, two beings who had spent lifetimes fearing the unknown reached a fragile understanding. A pelt was laid on the ground. A carved bone was offered in return. No words passed between them, only recognition, the realization that the other was not beast, but something uncannily familiar. Archaeologists have searched for the fingerprints of this moment in scattered fragments of stone and pigment, in the shared layers of ancient caves where both species once lived. Evidence from sites like Châtel-Perron, Grotte du Renne, and Saint-Césaire in France hints at this remarkable overlap. Tools once thought to belong solely to modern humans, refined blades, bone points, ornaments, and pigments have been found among Neanderthal remains. The conclusion is striking. The Neanderthals learned from the newcomers, and perhaps the newcomers learned from them. It was not merely contact, it was connection. These early exchanges were not just of materials, but of ideas. For the Neanderthals, who had endured the ice for hundreds of thousands of years, survival was rooted in tradition. For the modern humans, survival was rooted in innovation. When these two ways of life met, something new was born. A piece of ochre traded for flint, a strand of sinew offered for stone. These were gestures that required no language, only intent. Each action carried the weight of trust, however momentary. To imagine that encounter is to see the dawn of communication without words. Two pairs of eyes meet across the firelight, measuring, reflecting, learning. There is caution, but also something else, curiosity, the beginning of empathy. They study each other's faces, their tools, their movements. Perhaps they mimic, perhaps they teach. The exchange is not just of goods, but of knowledge. Through these interactions, the Neanderthals began adopting finer blade technology and ornamentation, while modern humans, in turn, absorbed the deep environmental wisdom of those who had known this land far longer. The archaeological record suggests these contacts were repeated over generations. Shared habitation layers, similar tool styles, and even overlapping diets point to cooperation and coexistence. It is a story of adaptation through contact, a reminder that evolution does not always favor strength or numbers, it favors connection. In the frozen world of the Pleistocene, understanding could mean survival. Yet beneath this fragile harmony lingered the shadow of inevitability. The newcomers were growing in number, spreading faster, their settlements expanding with every passing season. For the Neanderthals, whose strength lay in stability and routine, this change would prove both a gift and a warning. The knowledge they exchanged gave them temporary resilience, but the world itself was shifting toward the stranger's rhythm. Still, in that brief moment, when two fires burned close enough for warmth to be shared, humanity glimpsed what it was capable of becoming. The exchange was not a transaction, it was a bridge, one built of instinct, curiosity, and mutual recognition. Across the ice and silence, two versions of humankind met not as enemies, but as reflections. And for that fleeting instant, the cold world seemed to pause, as if the earth itself was watching the first spark of understanding between kindred species who did not yet know they were one. The world was never still. Even in the age of ice, the earth breathed in slow rhythms of change, warming, cooling, expanding, contracting. For the Neanderthals, the sky was their calendar, the wind their herald. When the light changed, they knew what was coming. The air grew warmer, then colder again. Seasons that once returned faithfully began to betray them. Rivers vanished into ice, forests thinned, and the once abundant herds of bison and reindeer moved farther south. For a people bound to the pulse of the land, the very pattern of life was unraveling. Climate scientists studying sediment cores and glacial records can read the story the Neanderthals lived through. Abrupt temperature shifts across Europe, some within a single generation. One year the grasslands bloomed with wildflowers. The next, they were buried beneath snow. The boundaries between seasons blurred. Rain turned to sleet, sleet to silence. Even the stars seemed to shift, as the air filled with haze from distant volcanic eruptions. To the Neanderthals, the sky itself must have felt uncertain, like a vast, breathing animal whose moods no one could predict. In this world of instability, survival became movement. The tribe followed the herds that still roamed, though fewer each year. Archaeological layers across the continent show a restless migration camps, abandoned, tools left behind, fires extinguished long before their time. These traces tell of a people who were experts in endurance, but now faced a challenge that no skill could master. The land they had shaped their lives around was changing faster than they could adapt. As the glaciers advanced, Europe became a maze of barriers. Valleys once rich with vegetation turned to wastelands of ice. Winds carried dust instead of scent, and the silence between storms grew heavy. To the Neanderthals, the world must have seemed to shrink. Every season, the horizon drew closer. The great plains of mammoth and bison were now corridors of peril, the forests shallow refuges clinging to warmth. Each journey to follow food became longer, each return more uncertain. Fossil evidence shows that their numbers began to dwindle. Genetic diversity decreased, skeletal remains become rarer, and settlement sites fewer. This was not extinction by disaster but by exhaustion. They were being worn away, grain by grain, by a world that no longer favored them. Yet even as their range shrank, their persistence was astonishing. They hunted smaller animals, gathered roots, trapped birds, and learned to endure where others might have perished. They had faced 1,000 winters before, and believed they could face 1,000 more. But the changing sky was relentless. The balance that had once defined their world was tipping toward chaos. Ice crept farther south each year, sealing the rivers they drank from, silencing the ground beneath their feet. The world was turning into something unrecognizable, a place made for movement, not for settlement, for adaptation beyond what their lineage had ever known. And still they moved. Always moving, always fewer. Their lives now measured in footsteps across the shrinking land. The warmth that once lingered after spring hunts vanished more quickly with each passing year. The Neanderthals watched the sun grow pale and distant, the stars cold and dim. Beneath that changing sky, they continued their quiet migration through the ruins of their own age, unaware that the story of their world was drawing to its final chapter, written not in words, but in wind, ice, and silence. In the deep silence of the mountains, where the wind no longer reaches and the light of day fades into stone, there lies a place where memory and death intertwine. The Neanderthals knew these caverns well. To them, caves were not just shelter from the storm or refuge from the cold, they were thresholds between the living and the eternal. When they entered the earth, they were not merely seeking protection, they were returning home. Archaeologists have uncovered these sacred spaces, their secrets preserved in layers of soil and shadow. In the cave of Shanidar, nestled in the mountains of northern Iraq, the bones of Neanderthals were found carefully arranged. Around one skeleton, traces of pollen were discovered, grains from wildflowers placed with intention. Some dismissed it as coincidence, but the pattern told another story. The flowers were not scattered by chance. They were chosen, laid beside the dead in what may have been the first gesture of mourning ever made by human hands. In La Chapelle-aux-Saints, France, a similar truth emerges. The body of an elderly Neanderthal, crippled by age and arthritis, had been gently buried in a hollowed pit, his head resting upon the earth, his limbs positioned with care. He had lived long past usefulness, yet his people had tended to him, fed him, and when his time came, they gave him a place of rest. This was not instinct, this was reverence. The Neanderthals understood death not as an end, but as a continuation, a passage into the deep earth that had always given them life. To bury their dead was to honor them, to preserve connection across the fragile boundary between existence and memory. In this ritual, they revealed something profoundly human: awareness of loss and the need to give it meaning. Inside these caves, time stands still. The air is cool and still, carrying the scent of stone and dust. Torchlight once flickered across the walls, illuminating skulls ringed with ochre, bones arranged in quiet order. Each burial was a message to the future. We were here. We remembered. We cared. The ochre, rich and red, was not chosen by accident. Its color mirrored blood and sunset, the cycle of life and death they witnessed each day. Even in their grief, there was beauty. In those moments of farewell, they must have sensed the fragility of their world. The land outside was growing colder, the forests thinner, the herds fewer. Their numbers were dwindling, and yet they paused to honor those who had fallen. This act, so intimate and deliberate, reveals a consciousness far beyond survival. It was an acknowledgement of impermanence, a whisper into the void that even if they vanished, their memory would not. The Cave of Bones stands today as one of the oldest monuments to empathy. It is proof that before there were temples or priests, before history began to record, there existed a people who understood the sacred weight of life and death. When they placed their dead in the earth, they were not surrendering to loss, they were teaching the world what it means to remember. Long after their fires burned out and their voices faded, these silent graves remain. Beneath the stone, beneath the dust of ages, the Neanderthals still rest among their flowers and ochre. They left behind no empire, no written word, but in these quiet chambers, they left something far greater: the first echo of compassion, carved into the bones of time itself. The silence did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly across the plains, carried by the wind that once carried voices. Where fires had burned, only ashes remained. Where laughter had once risen into the cold air, now there was only the sound of snow settling over forgotten footprints. The Neanderthals, once spread across the vast expanse of Europe and Western Asia, were fading not in a single moment of tragedy, but through a slow and quiet unraveling. The great plains that had once echoed with their movement were changing. The herds that had sustained them, bison, reindeer, mammoth, migrated farther south as the ice thickened and the seasons grew erratic. Rivers dried into cracked mirrors of ice. Valleys that had once thrived with forests and prey became graveyards of frost. The Neanderthals followed as long as they could, but each journey grew harder. Each winter claimed more lives than the last. Archaeological evidence shows the steady withdrawal of their presence. Caves once alive with firelight and tools fell silent. Flint flakes lie abandoned where they were last struck. The remains of meals grow smaller in number, the bones of small game replacing those of mammoths. Across the continent, their settlements became fewer, scattered like dying embers across a continent surrendering to the cold. It was not war that took them. It was time. Climate, scarcity, and isolation worked together in a rhythm of attrition. Small bands grew smaller still, until family groups that had once shared warmth and memory now wandered alone. The fires they carried flickered weakly against the growing wind. The world that had once seemed endless now pressed in on all sides. Scientists studying their bones find the story written in calcium and dust. Malnutrition etched itself into their skeletons. Signs of illness, of injury untreated, of exhaustion beyond recovery. Yet there are also signs of care: fractures healed, Elders tended, children buried with tenderness. Even as their numbers dwindled, their compassion did not fade. They remained human in the most essential way. They did not abandon one another. The silence that spread across their world was more than absence. It was a kind of mourning. The plains that had known their footsteps for hundreds of thousands of years now listened only to wind and snow. Each passing season erased a trace, a broken tool buried by frost, a hearth swallowed by earth, a name lost before language could record it. But in that fading, there was still dignity. They did not vanish in chaos or despair. They endured until endurance itself became impossible. Their final years were lived in the shadow of inevitability, yet they met it, as they had met every challenge before, with persistence, with care, and with quiet strength. Today, when scientists uncover the remains of those last families, they find not defeat, but testament. Their bones speak of struggle, but also of intelligence, craftsmanship, empathy, and fire. The silence of the plains was not the end of their story, it was the pause before memory. In that stillness, beneath a sky heavy with snow, the last echoes of their lives settled into the earth, waiting to be heard again. The wind that sweeps across Europe's ancient valleys still carries something of them. It moves through the same stones, the same trees, the same earth that once held their hands and footprints. The laughter may have faded, but it is not lost. It lingers in the soil, in the fossils, in the spark of fire that has never truly gone out. The silence of the plains was not emptiness, it was remembrance. In the final chapter of their long reign, the Neanderthals had become a whisper against the wind. Across the frozen plains of Europe, where herds once thundered and rivers once sang, only a handful remained. The great networks of families and tribes that had sustained them for generations had thinned to near nothing. What was once a thriving species spread from Iberia to Siberia now existed in fragments, small groups scattered across the edges of a continent turning to ice. Among them, somewhere in that vast emptiness, there was a last family. An elder, a young hunter, 2 women, and a child. That is how scientists imagine the final remnant of a lineage that had endured for over 300,000 years. They are not names written in history, but bones found in the soil, traces preserved in the ash of forgotten fires. Archaeologists studying sites such as Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar and Vindiha in Croatia believe that these regions may have sheltered some of the final Neanderthals. The evidence is faint but telling: soot from ancient hearths, cut marks on bone, the ghosts of habitation preserved in stone. Their world had narrowed to a few caves, a few fires, and the fragile continuity of memory. For the Neanderthals, family was more than survival, it was identity. They lived in small kin groups, bound by shared labor, affection, and memory. When the great networks that once allowed trade, knowledge, and companionship disappeared, they turned inward. Every gesture, every shared meal, every sound around the fire became sacred, because it was all that remained of their people. The elder would have carried the memory of hunts and migrations long past, stories passed through gesture and example rather than words. The young hunter would have represented endurance, the continuation of skill and purpose. The 2 women would have held the rhythm of daily life, fire tending, hide curing, teaching the child. The child, unaware of the weight of history, would have been the future that would never arrive. Life in these final years was fragile, but not hopeless. They still hunted small game, gathered roots, and fished along the coasts where warmth lingered. Flint was still shaped by steady hands. Fire still burned. But the world around them no longer answered to their rhythm. The climate was turning colder once again, and the ecosystems that had sustained them for millennia were vanishing. The prey animals moved south, chased by the freeze. The land that once gave life now withheld it. Yet even as the Neanderthals dwindled, their resilience remained undiminished. Their tools grew more refined, their shelters more carefully built. They had no concept of extinction, no sense of being the last of anything. They lived as they always had, one day at a time, each fire a victory against the dark. To them, the world was not ending. It was simply changing in ways they could not yet understand. When their final fire burned low, the smoke would have risen into the same sky that had watched over their ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years. The stars above shone no differently for them than for us. They would not have known that their line was ending, that no new child would grow to carry their memory forward. But the earth would remember. In the story of humanity, this last family represents something beyond tragedy. They are the final heartbeat of an ancient song, the last echo of a people who taught the world how to endure. Their bloodline vanished, but their essence did not. It lived on in the warmth of fire, in the shaping of stone, in the instinct to care for one another when the world grows cold. The last family of the Neanderthals was not defeated, they simply became part of the silence, woven into the fabric of time itself. The end of a world rarely comes with thunder. More often, it arrives quietly, disguised as change. For the last Neanderthals, that change had a face and a fire. Across the valleys, beyond the forests they still called home, another kind of human was spreading. The Neanderthals saw the signs long before they saw the strangers themselves. Smoke on the horizon where there had never been smoke before. The faint echo of laughter carried on the wind. Strange tools found near water, shaped with a precision unfamiliar to their eyes. The earth that had belonged to them for hundreds of millennia was no longer theirs alone. Archaeological records tell of this overlap, this uneasy coexistence between two species of human. In places like the Iberian Peninsula, the final refuge of the Neanderthals, evidence shows that modern humans had already arrived. Their fires burned differently, smaller and faster, fueled by a restless kind of motion. Their tools, finer and more varied, spoke of innovation and experimentation. The Neanderthals, in contrast, lived by a steadier rhythm, one refined through ages of tradition. They did not build empires or dream of distant places. They lived within the pulse of their environment, moving only as the land required. But now, the land itself was shifting beneath their feet. To the Neanderthals, the newcomers must have seemed like a disturbance in the balance of things. Where once there was silence, there was now noise, movement, shouting, song. Where herds grazed peacefully, hunters appeared in numbers never before seen. Game became scarce, rivers muddied with footprints. The Neanderthals retreated into the forests, into the high ridges where the wind carried the scent of pine and the memory of solitude. They watched the glow of foreign fires from afar and did not approach. They had learned, through ages of survival, that sometimes endurance meant invisibility. But the shadows that stretched across the plains were growing longer. Modern humans were not predators in the usual sense. They did not hunt the Neanderthals for meat or dominance. They outnumbered them, outlasted them, and perhaps most importantly, out-imagined them. The newcomers painted the walls of caves with animals and visions, carved bone into tools and art. Their lives were built not just around survival, but around meaning. The Neanderthals, masters of endurance, suddenly found themselves living alongside a species that looked beyond the moment, that planned for futures they could not yet see. Still, the Neanderthals adapted as they always had. They moved in silence, conserving their strength, avoiding conflict. The forests became their refuge, their last sanctuary against the expanding tide of humanity. Theirs was a fading kingdom of frost and memory, guarded by instinct and restraint. Yet even in retreat, they left their marked stone blades scattered across Europe, cave soot layered above that of the newcomers, faint traces of hearths hidden deep within forgotten caverns. What must it have felt like, to watch another people take the world that had once been yours? To see the same firelight, the same gestures, The same faces, only different, faster, louder, more numerous. The Neanderthals must have sensed something slipping away, something ancient and irreplaceable. They had always shared the land with predators and prey, but never before with rivals who carried the same spark of awareness. In time, even the forests could no longer protect them. The strangers' fire spread across every horizon, each generation pushing farther into the cold, claiming the plains and rivers that had shaped the Neanderthal soul. There were no battles, no conquests, no great collapse, only silence, where there had once been song. The shadow of the others grew until it became the world itself. And so, unseen and unheard, the last Neanderthals faded into the trees. Their fires went out one by one, leaving behind only ash and stone, mute reminders of a people who had once ruled the Ice Age. The strangers who followed would never know their names, only their echoes. Yet the memory of that silence, the long twilight of one humanity meeting another, still lingers in the earth, in the wind, and in the firelight of every human night since. Dreams were the one refuge no winter could touch. When the land froze and the winds carved through valleys like invisible knives, the mind still carried warmth. For the last Neanderthal hunters, memory and dream had begun to blur, one bleeding quietly into the other. Sleep was not an escape, it was a return. In dreams, the plains were still green. The mammoths still moved in herds across open sunlight. Rivers flowed freely. And laughter, not silence, filled the air. In those fragile visions, the world was as it once had been, before the cold had swallowed it whole. Scientists who study the rhythm of prehistoric life know that memory shaped the Neanderthal's mind as deeply as hunger shaped their body. Their days followed cycles written by the earth itself, the migration of animals, the turning of seasons, the glow of stars that marked the return of warmth. But when those patterns faltered, when the herds stopped coming and the trees no longer bloomed, something in their perception must have fractured. The dreams of the young hunter, whether sleeping or waking, would have carried the ghost of what once was. Archaeologists uncover this story not in words, but in the layers of soot and bone left behind. In the last sites where Neanderthals lived, Gibraltar, the Ural foothills, the valleys of southern France, the evidence speaks of scarcity and persistence. Smaller fires, fewer tools, bones of smaller prey. Yet among these remains, there is also art. Etched lines on a cave wall, a pattern carved into stone. Perhaps it was not art as we know it, but it was meaning, carved from memory. These marks, primitive yet deliberate, suggest a mind turning inward, reflecting on something that could not be hunted or eaten, the past itself. The Neanderthals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years in balance with their world. Their knowledge of it was instinctive, intimate, and deep. When that balance broke, the dissonance must have haunted them. They were not creatures of imagination in the way modern humans were, but they understood the ache of loss. The young hunter, sleeping beside a dying fire, might have dreamed of the smell of wet grass, of the sound of hooves shaking the ground. He might have remembered faces no longer there, voices silenced by hunger or cold. His dreams were not of conquest or creation, but of restoration, a longing for the world that had raised his people. This blending of dream and memory marked more than the end of a species. It was the birth of reflection. To dream of the past is to understand time. To mourn what is gone is to be human. In this, the Neanderthals were not so different from us. Their brains, their emotions, their capacity to imagine these were not alien. They were simply quieter, shaped by survival rather than ambition. As the last families dwindled and the fires grew fewer, the dreams of the living became the final record of their world. They dreamed of warmth, of sound, of plenty. They dreamed of connection, of the herds and the hunt, of laughter echoing in caves now filled with silence. And when they awoke to snow, when their breath turned to ghosts in the air, those dreams lingered like smoke, thin, fragile, yet unbroken. In the end, it was not the cold that truly conquered them, but time. Yet in their final nights, when the flames flickered low and the wind whispered through the stones, the Neanderthals carried within them a vision of what had been a memory so powerful it outlived their bodies, passing into the deep story of humanity. The hunter's dream was not just his own. It was the dream of a species on the edge of forever, holding on to light even as the darkness closed in. The fire was the last heartbeat of their world. In its dim light, the ancient rhythm of survival flickered for the final time. The logs that once crackled with life now smoldered into silence, their warmth fading into the cold breath of an endless winter. Beyond the faint glow of dying embers, the ice age stretched unbroken, swallowing forest, valley, and sky. The Neanderthals had survived every cruelty the earth could conjure, but even endurance has limits. The last warmth of their kind was fading. Archaeological evidence from the closing millennia of Neanderthal existence shows how fragile life had become. Layers of charcoal and bone in southern European caves grow thin, then vanish. Hearths once rebuilt with care were abandoned, their ash preserved like fingerprints in stone. Flint tools found beside them are worn and reused beyond practicality, each one a sign of scarcity. The pattern is clear. Their world was shrinking. The great herds had moved south. The rivers froze deep, and the trees that fed their fires were disappearing from the cold. To the Neanderthals, fire had always been more than survival. It was memory, connection, and home. For generations, it had held the night at bay, kept the beasts at distance, and turned raw meat into sustenance. Around it, children were born, the dead were mourned, and knowledge passed silently from elder to youth. When the flames dimmed, so too did the continuity of their world. The glow that had once marked their dominance over the cold was now a fragile reminder of what they were losing. As resources waned, the Neanderthals were forced to retreat deeper into the margins of the continent. In places like Gorham's Cave and Spy in Belgium, their final strongholds clung to the edges of the sea or nestled against cliffs that offered shelter from the wind. But even there, the climate's grip tightened. The forests that once surrounded them thinned into tundra. Where wood had once been plentiful, now only bone or dried moss could be burned. The fire became a luxury, tended with reverence, fed with desperation. Anthropologists believe their social bonds must have grown stronger as their numbers fell. The small families that remained would have depended on one another completely. Their gestures, their shared silences, their routines, all carried the weight of inheritance. Yet beneath this unity was a quiet knowing. The elder who had seen many winters would have understood that the balance had shifted beyond repair. The world that had sustained their ancestors was no longer theirs to inhabit. The cold deepened each night, pressing against their shelters like a living force. The snow outside no longer melted, it accumulated, layer upon layer, sealing the earth beneath a white shroud. The animals that once roamed freely were gone or beyond reach. Hunger became constant. Fatigue settled into their bones. The fire, which had always represented defiance, now flickered with inevitability. Still, they did not surrender easily. The embers were stirred again and again, coaxed to life with fragments of bark and bone. The last warmth clung to them in defiance of extinction. But even flame has memory, and memory fades. When the final log burned down to ash, the light dimmed until only the faintest glow remained, a single ember, a single heartbeat, a single species standing against time. The Neanderthals had lived through hundreds of thousands of winters, but this one was different. This one would not end. The fire that had carried them through every storm was now no longer enough. As the last sparks dissolved into the dark, The silence that followed was not defeat, but closure, the quiet ending of an era that had burned bright for too long to be forgotten. The fire grew dim, but in that dimness, it left behind a trace of light that would never truly go out. The Ice Age reached its deepest silence. Across the white expanse of Europe, winter no longer came and went, it simply stayed. The sun lingered low and weak over a horizon of frost, its light too thin to bring warmth, its color pale as bone. Wind tore through the valleys, sweeping over the remains of forests long dead, over plains once alive with the thunder of hooves. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. In this frozen stillness, the story of the Neanderthals entered its final hour. By this time, their world had narrowed to a few scattered refuges, pockets of life clinging to the edges of a continent turning to ice. The Neanderthals had endured for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to every challenge the planet could conjure. But now, even endurance had limits. The cold pressed harder, the food grew scarce, and the warmth of companionship became as precious as the glow of fire. Archaeological traces from these final settlements tell of shrinking groups, of tools worn to nothing, of shelters repaired again and again as the world outside became uninhabitable. To survive this endless winter required more than skill. It demanded faith not in gods or destiny, but in one another. For the Neanderthals, community had always been their strength. They had cared for the sick, buried their dead, and shared every kill. But in the long night, even these bonds began to fray. As famine deepened, some groups dissolved entirely. Others stayed together to the end. Their remains found close, often curled beside one another, preserved in the same soil that once sheltered them from the storm. The wind that howled across those final valleys would have carried no sound of animals, no rustle of trees, no voices of kin. Silence ruled everything now. The last firelight reflected against snow and stone, dim and trembling. In its glow, the outlines of a vanished world flickered memories of hunts beneath the summer sun, the laughter of children, the scent of rain before the freeze. For the last of their kind, memory became the only warmth left. When we look back through the lens of time, the archaeological record is heartbreakingly quiet. Layers of habitation end abruptly. Flint scatters without pattern. The hearths grow cold and dark. The last footprints, pressed into ancient clay, lead nowhere. At sites like Gorham's Cave and Vindiha, it is as though life simply stopped. Yet this quiet was not surrender, it was inevitability. The Neanderthals had not been defeated by strength or violence, but by the slow, unstoppable rhythm of change. And still, their final moments carry a kind of grace. The evidence of burial, of care for the fallen, continues until the very end. Even when hunger must have clouded thought, they still found the will to tend the dead. Stones laid carefully over bodies, bones arranged with intention. These gestures, small yet profound, reveal the truth of who they were. Not beasts driven by instinct, but people bound by memory and compassion. In that last cave, as the wind howled outside, one young survivor may have seen his world vanish. The elder who taught him to hunt, the mother who tended the fire, the child whose laughter once filled the dark all gone, their warmth surrendered to the cold. The long night was not merely a season, it was an ending, a curtain drawn across a chapter of humanity's own reflection. But even as the snow buried their final resting places, the Neanderthals did not disappear into nothing. They left behind the trace of their hands, the proof of their intelligence, and the quiet dignity of their final days. The long night took their bodies, but not their story. The world they shaped would one day awaken again beneath new skies, carrying within it the echoes of their endurance. And when the ice finally began to thaw, the earth would remember them not as shadows lost to time, but as the first dreamers of the human fire. At the edge of the world, where land surrendered to the restless sea, the last Neanderthals found their final refuge. The glaciers behind them pressed forward like a living wall, and before them stretched an ocean vast and merciless. Here, on the southern coasts of Europe, perhaps in a cave overlooking the cold Atlantic at Gibraltar, their long journey came to rest. The earth had changed beyond recognition, but the sea, endless and gray, still moved as it always had. It was both boundary and promise, the last great mirror of a dying world. Archaeologists studying these coastal caves have uncovered what remains of that final stand. In Gorham's cave, soot still stains the walls, proof of fires that once glowed against the roar of the wind. Scattered bones of birds and shellfish speak of adaptation, of resourcefulness in the face of extinction. These Neanderthals had turned to the sea for sustenance when the land could no longer provide. They cracked shells for meat, hunted seals along the rocks, and caught fish in the shallows. Theirs was not a people defeated, but one still fighting for a place in a world that had begun to move on without them. The air by the coast was different. Salt clung to every breath, and the rhythm of the waves became a heartbeat against the silence that had swallowed the inland plains. To stand there, looking out over the water, must have been to glimpse something infinite, a horizon without end. Perhaps, in moments of stillness, they watched the movement of seabirds and found comfort in their constancy. The sea did not freeze. It did not vanish. It remained alive when everything else had turned to ice. Life in those final coastal refuges was precarious, but not empty. The Neanderthals still shaped flint blades, still tended fire, still shared food in the glow of their hearths. The marks of their tools found in those caves are sharp and deliberate, showing the persistence of craftsmanship even in desperation. They were not fading quietly. They were surviving in the only way they knew how, through ingenuity, cooperation, and faith in the small rituals that had always sustained them. For thousands of generations, their ancestors had known only the language of the land forests, rivers, plains. But here, they encountered something different. The sea introduced a new kind of mystery. Its movement, its sound, its vastness, all would have stirred something unfamiliar in their minds. It may have been the first time a human stood on a shore and felt the pull of infinity. The waves breaking before them were the same that touched distant lands they would never see. The same that reflected the same stars their ancestors had once looked upon in the mountains. In this cave by the sea, time began to lose its shape. The Neanderthals had no way to know they were the last, that their fires would be the final ones of their kind. But the evidence left behind suggests an awareness of place, of belonging. They marked the stone walls with etchings, abstract lines, deliberate and rhythmic. Whether these carvings were art, record, or meditation, no one can say. But they were not random. They were thought made visible, the trace of minds that still sought meaning in the face of ending. As the storms gathered and the sea surged higher, their fires would have flickered, reflected in the wet stone. The sound of the waves filled the silence left by vanished voices, and there, at the farthest edge of their world, the Neanderthals endured a little longer, their footprints pressed into the sand beside the tide. When the ocean finally rose to claim their caves, it erased their presence from sight, but not from memory. The cave by the sea stands as their last monument, a testament to survival in its purest form. Even as the cold consumed the earth, they kept a fire burning against the wind, whispering to the waves as if to say, "We were here." And for a brief moment in time, beneath the pale sky of a dying world, the sea answered not in words, but in the eternal rhythm of its tide. The earth trembled before the end. Somewhere far beyond the coastlines and plains where the last Neanderthals endured, the mountains erupted with a fury older than life itself. It began as a low, distant rumble, then a roar that rolled across continents. A plume of ash surged skyward, blotting out the sun. For days and weeks, the sky darkened until day became a shadow of itself. The wind, once clear and cold, now carried dust and sulfur, spreading darkness across the world. The Ice Age, already brutal, now wore a crown of fire. Scientists call this the Campanian ignimbrite eruption, one of the largest volcanic events in the last 200,000 years. It tore through southern Italy roughly 40,000 years ago, sending millions of tons of ash into the air. The effects were global. Forests collapsed beneath the weight of falling dust, rivers choked with debris, and the sunlight itself dimmed to an eerie twilight. For the Neanderthals, already clinging to survival, this catastrophe may have been the final blow. Their world, frozen, fractured, and fragile, was plunged into darkness. Imagine standing at the edge of the sea during those weeks. The horizon disappeared beneath a gray veil, the ocean turning black with ash. The smell of sulfur mixed with salt and flakes of volcanic dust fell like snow upon the shore. Even the air became heavy, harder to breathe. The once familiar cries of seabirds faded, replaced by a silence that felt alive. For the last Neanderthals, there would have been no understanding of what was happening, only the knowledge that the world itself had changed. The fire of the mountains had reached the sky. Across Europe, the record of this moment lies buried in layers of ash. Archaeological sites show a sudden pause in activity. Hearths go cold, settlements empty. It was not only the Neanderthals who suffered the eruption's aftermath, altered ecosystems for decades. Plants failed to grow, herds died or migrated beyond reach. The temperature dropped even further as the sun's warmth was filtered through the thick haze. The fragile balance of survival that the Neanderthals had maintained for generations was broken, and yet, within that darkness, they endured a little longer. In the coastal caves of southern Spain and Gibraltar, traces of soot on walls tell of fires still being lit even after the sky fell silent. Flint tools, worn smooth from use, show that the last of their kind continued to shape stone, to hunt, to live. There was resilience still, though the land itself had turned against them. The eruption was not just a geological event, it was symbolic. The old world was collapsing. The Ice Age, once ruled by Neanderthals, was yielding to the age of Homo sapiens. The ash that blotted out the sun also marked the dawn of a new kind of humanity, one that would inherit the earth. But for the Neanderthals, it must have felt like the gods themselves had turned away. In those final days, when the sky was neither night nor day, the last survivor may have stood by the sea, watching the horizon disappear. The water, once silver and alive, had turned to ink. The mountains that once offered shelter now spat darkness. Every instinct within him, honed over centuries of struggle, must have told him to move to seek safety, but there was nowhere left to go. The ash fell endlessly, coating the land in a shroud of silence. The sea rolled black and heavy beneath the dim light of a dying sun, and in that moment, as the world held its breath, the story of the Neanderthals neared its close. Not with war, not with failure, but with a sky of ash and light, a final, haunting beauty over a people who had walked the earth longer than any civilization that would ever come after them. The fire that darkened the heavens also illuminated their legacy, casting their endurance across time, a brief, brilliant glow that still lingers in the bones of the earth. When the light returned, it was not the same light that had once warmed the earth. It came through a haze, weak and fractured, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to shine. The ash had settled into the sea, turning its surface to liquid slate. The air still carried the scent of fire and salt. In this pale, muted dawn, one figure remained. Alone on the shore, surrounded by the remnants of a vanished world, he stood where the continent met the endless horizon. The last Neanderthal, the final echo of a species that had walked this earth for more than 300,000 years. The evidence of his world now lies buried beneath layers of sediment, but its story endures through stone and bone. Archaeologists call this moment the end of the Neanderthals, around 40,000 years ago, when their last refuges along the Iberian coast fell silent. The hearths went dark. The tools stopped being made. The footprints that once pressed into the wet sand disappeared beneath time. Yet those traces speak of a life that did not end in weakness, but in dignity. Even as the cold deepened and the sky dimmed, they held on to what made them human: the will to endure, the reverence for the world that sustained them, and the quiet courage to face the inevitable. To imagine that final morning is to imagine a stillness that feels both sacred and unbearable. The sea moves without rhythm. The wind carries no scent of life. Around him, the world is empty of voices. The others, his family, his tribe, are gone. Their fires have gone out. Their tools lie buried beneath ash and sand. But their memory lingers in the land itself, in every stone, flake, and soot mark left behind. He stands at the meeting point of history and eternity, his breath clouding in the cold air, the last living thread of an unbroken story stretching back to the dawn of humankind. Scientists have long debated what caused this ending. Was it the changing climate, the arrival of modern humans, or a slow erosion of population and habitat? The truth, perhaps, is all of these factors woven together into a quiet inevitability. The Neanderthals did not vanish in a single moment. They dwindled gently, generation by generation, until only one remained to witness the dawn. Theirs was not extinction by catastrophe, but by transition, the passing of a torch from one humanity to another. The last Neanderthal would have known nothing of this. For him, life was not a concept. It was a feeling: the sound of the tide, the warmth of a small fire, the rhythm of his own heartbeat in the silence. When he looked into the still water, he would have seen his reflection ripple and break. What stared back at him was not a beast, not a shadow of humanity, but something profoundly familiar. Broad brow, strong jaw, deep eyes that had seen more winters than the species that would follow him ever could. His face was the face of endurance itself, carved by survival, shaped by time. In that reflection, perhaps there was understanding, the knowledge that the world had changed beyond return. The herds were gone. The forests had died. The stars above seemed colder. Yet there was still beauty, the shimmer of light on the waves, the distant call of wind through stone. He may have closed his eyes, not in despair, but in peace, surrendering his breath to the same air that had carried the voices of his ancestors. And then, only the sea remained. The waves rose and fell, carrying his silence outward, scattering it across the water and into the wind. The last morning of the Neanderthals was not an ending, but an awakening of memory. The tide took him, and in doing so, returned him to the world that had made him. The horizon stretched open, limitless and indifferent, and somewhere in that boundless expanse, humanity's story continued. Long after his footprints faded, the sea still whispered against the stone, repeating what he could not say. We were here. We lived. We endured. The cave grows cold. The air inside it is heavy with stillness, the kind of silence that settles only after the last voice has faded. The soot on the walls, once black with the smoke of countless fires, now lies untouched, coated in frost. The hearth, the heart of their world, is no longer alive. Its ashes have cooled, its stones cracked by the shifting of ice. Outside, the wind scours the cliffs, erasing the final traces of a people who once called this place home. Yet, if one were to look closely, beneath the snow and centuries, they would find the faint imprint of feet pressed into the frozen earth. Footprints leading toward the sea, then stopping where the tide once reached. Beyond that point, only silence. The last of the Neanderthals are gone, but their presence lingers in the landscape they shaped, in the mountains they climbed, in the caves where their fires once flickered against the dark. For more than 300 millennia, they endured the longest reign of any human species before or since. They hunted mammoths beneath the ice, built tools from stone, and learned the rhythm of the earth as though it were a song. They buried their dead, cared for their injured, and taught their children to survive in a world that demanded everything. When their story ended, it was not in battle or collapse, but in a slow, inevitable fading, a quiet surrender to the turning of time. Archaeologists today uncover the fragments of that fading world, their tools, their bones, the traces of hearths that once blazed with warmth. Each discovery breathes life back into their memory, reminding us that the line between them and us is thinner than we once believed. They were not our opposites. They were our kin. They laughed, they feared, they loved, and they dreamed beneath the same stars that still hang above us now. Their extinction did not erase them. It transformed them into the foundation of what we became. A small part of their essence, their endurance, their instinct, remains alive in the story of humanity. As the Ice Age deepened, the world moved on. Forests crept southward, glaciers consumed valleys, and new humans, our ancestors, spread across the continents. The torch of survival passed from one kind of humanity to another, yet beneath that transition lies continuity, not replacement. The Neanderthals were the first keepers of fire in the snow, the first to stand against a world that did not forgive weakness. Every spark we light today, every home that gathers around warmth and shadow, is a quiet echo of theirs. The cave by the sea, long abandoned, still holds a kind of sacred weight. It is both tomb and testament. In its walls, carved by smoke and touch, the story of endurance is written. The snow that drifts through its entrance glows faintly in the dawn, catching the light of a sun that once shone on them too. And somewhere beneath the frozen layers of earth, in a pocket of ash or a buried hearthstone, a single fragment of charcoal waits. It is cold, yes, but unbroken, a memory of flame preserved by time. The world moved on, as it always does, yet the Neanderthals never truly vanished. They remain in the stone, in the soil, in the quiet spaces between wind and memory. Theirs was not a failure of evolution, but a lesson in impermanence. Everything changes, even the creatures who once thought themselves eternal. And still, beneath the snow, something endures. The last ember of their fire glows unseen. Deep in the dark earth, a silent reminder that no light is ever truly lost. When we look into our own fires, when we stare into the flicker of flame and feel both comfort and awe, we are not alone. We are remembering them. We are carrying their warmth forward through time. The Neanderthals' world is gone, but their story remains written in ours, the fire in the snow that refuses to die.